My name is Carrie Marsh, and I'm the director of the Clark Historical Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Clark Speaker Series event, the David and Eunice Sutherland Burgess Lecture, which was endowed by the Burgesses to support authors, storytellers, and scholars to come to campus to talk about the enduring importance of storytelling. So let's begin this evening by acknowledging that today we are on the beautiful lands maintained for generations by the Anishinaabe people, the indigenous inhabitants of Michigan, with whom we continue to partner today here at Central Michigan University. Studies from the University of Minnesota. And in her research, she works between the French early modern tale tradition and 20th and 21st century French fairy tale film. Her most recent books include The Lost Princess, Women Writers and the History of Classic Fairy Tales from 2023, the second revised edition of Salonier, Furies and Fairies, The Politics of Gender and Cultural Change in Absolutist France in 2021, the edited volume, A Cultural History of Fairy Tales in the Long 18th Century from 2021, and the co-edited and translated work, Women Writing Wonder, an anthology of subversive 19th century British, French, and German fairy tales with Julie Kohler, Shandy Wagner, and Adrienne Dula. So in her presentation this evening, Dr. Duggan will discuss the history and legacies of early modern French author Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy's version of the Cinderella tale, which features an empowered and enterprising Cinderella. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ann Duggan.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think I've got it. Yes. So before I begin, I really want to thank Carrie Marsh for inviting me to be here as part of the Clark Historical Library and for hosting me today. We had a wonderful lunch, and I was also it was wonderful to see Amy Ransom, my fellow Minnesotan alum, and Layla and Ali, with whom we've been collaborating on French things, trying to promote French in Michigan. So I'm really happy to be here with everybody and to share a different perspective on fairy tales. So I'm going to talk about this is part of my book, The Lost Princess, and I'm really interested. We tend to think of fairy tales as being full of passive princesses. We think of Grimm's, Andersen, and Perrault as, the fathers of the fairy tale. We also think of fairy tales as going from oral to written culture, and I'm going to blow all this up. And we're going to find a different history. And I'm going to read from the flyer because I want to put your mind in a different state. Because when we say Cinderella, we automatically think of Disney. Everyone thinks they know the Cinderella tale. And today I want you to imagine the Cinderella who kills her stepmother, decapitates an ogress, or triumphantly splashes mud on her sisters on her way to trying on the famed shoe or slipper. It has different names, we'll see. These are not the first images that come to mind when we think of Cinderella in our post-Disney world. And Disney is such an influence on how we understand Cinderella. But all of these variants, as we will see, of the Cinderella story competed with each other for generations, with one woman author, Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy, who produced a variant, Finette-Cendron or Finette-Cinders, that was not only frequently reproduced in France, England, and Germany, but also fed into oral traditions. And oral traditions not only in France, but also in the United States, in Czechoslovakia, in Germany, eventually also serving as inspiration for a really popular German-Czech co-produced film from 1973, Three Hazelnuts or Three Wishes for Cinderella. So we're going to look today at the legacy. First, I'm going to kind of show where did d'Aulnoy's Finette-Cinders or Finette-Cendron, I'll use both of those wordings throughout the talk. Where did she get the ideas from that? And we're going to see it's not from oral tradition. And we're also going to see the legacies of that tale, how it fed into oral culture, but also even eventually film. So we tend to think of their stereotype fairy tales come from oral tradition and then people wrote them down. And actually, our current Western European fairy tales like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Puss in Boots actually started in Italy. And these were not written for children, they were written for adults. They're aristocratic and urban tales. And basically what happens is we had Italian literary writers, so they wrote literary versions of fairy tales. Then the French aristocrats in the 17th century are going to read them, and they're actually going to feed into German tradition as well. And two of the writers that are the most important are Giovanni Francesco Straparella. From the 16th century, he wrote a tale called The Pig Prince, which is an animal bridegroom tale, which is in the tradition of Beauty and the Beast. He wrote the first known literary version of Puss in Boots, and other fairy tales. Basile, Giambattista Basile, who we'll talk more about today, he wrote the second known literary version of Puss in Boots, and he read Straparella's version and changed it. So there's a lot of that going on. He wrote The Cat Cinderella, which is the first literary version we know of Cinderella that is actually going to feed into all the subsequent versions. He also has a tale called Sun, Moon, and Talia, and Charles Perrault adapted the tale to make Sleeping Beauty. So he did not get it from oral culture. So we have these Italians wrote these tales. They were writing in urban context, not peasant, rural, or anything, writing in cities like Venice and Naples, and they're writing for aristocratic audiences, and they were writing for adults. So that's the context of tales in this period. So then in the 1690s, French writers discovered these Italian tales, and they're coming from aristocratic courtly circles. They're writing courtly tales. It's the period of Louis XIV, who built the Chateau de Versailles, which is actually a model for fairy palaces in a lot of these tales in this period. And Louis XIV is going to become more autocratic by the 1690s. There were many women writers connected to what we call salons, and salons were aristocratic circles run by women, but men and women both frequented them, and they would discuss literature, they discussed philosophy, sometimes even science. So these were kind of places where that generated ideas and literary texts, and that both women and men were writing from the context of the salon. The women fairy tale writers, we talk about the fairy tale writers of the 1690s, and that group of writers includes Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy, who I'll focus on today, Charlotte Rose de la Force, Henriette Julie de Murat, and they were all from the old nobility. They were all marginalized at court due to their bad behavior. Murat was exiled for writing a satire about Louis XIV's wife. Madame d'Aulnoy was imprisoned in convents by her husband, who she tried to have killed earlier, and it backfired, and she had to flee France. And La Force tried to get married to a man she loved, but at the time he needed parental consent, so the marriage was annulled and she was marginalized socially. So these are women who are coming from privileged positions at the same time that they're being marginalized. Charles Perrault, we don't always know in the United States Perrault's name, but we know his tales because Disney's Cinderella and Disney's Snow White are based on Perrault's versions of those tales. And he often they're all reading the Italian tales, and what Perrault tends to do is he makes the active heroines by Straparella and Basile more passive, and we'll see some examples of that today. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Marie-Jeanne L'Héritier. And among the women fairy tale writers, I refer to her as the good girl. She's never exiled. She doesn't get into trouble. She's related to Perrault, and she's actually the most vocal feminist in the group. And so when they're writing these fairy tales, all of these people know each other, and they know what they're writing, and they know the Italians. So that's kind of some of that background. So just to emphasize again, the tales we consider classic today did not move from oral to literary culture, but it tended to move from Italian writers who influenced French writers whose tales made their way to Germany, England, and other European countries, as well as the United States, as we'll see. So Basile's cat, Cinderella, I just taught this like 2 weeks ago, and the students love it because it's much more violent than our idea of Cinderella. But we have to keep in mind that when Basile is writing this, there is no Cinderella. This is the first Cinderella tale that's going to be circulating. And it stars Zezola, who's the daughter of a prince, and the prince's wife passed away. At the beginning of the story, Zezola has a wicked stepmother, and she complains about her wicked stepmother to her sewing teacher, I can never say this word, Carmosina. And she tells her sewing teacher, I really wish you were my stepmother. I can't stand this woman. So Carmosina is like, well, let me help you out. We can figure out a way to kill your stepmother, and then you convince your dad to marry me. And that's what happens. So Zezola kills stepmother number one, and doesn't realize that stepmother number two wasn't going to be that great. Carmosina brings her 6 daughters into the household. They're commoners, so there's a class difference in this version. Cinderella is the daughter she's a princess, and Carmosina is a commoner. And she raises her daughters above the status of Princess Zezola, who is going to carry out the lowly tasks in the household. And at one point in the tale, a fairy dove informs Zezola that should she wish for something, she need only send her request through the dove of the fairies in Sardinia, and her wish will be granted. So she's going to be communicating with the fairies via the dove. When Zezola's father prepares to leave for Sardinia on business, the stepsisters ask him to bring back luxury items, while Zezola asks him to promise to give his regards on her behalf to the dove of the fairies and to ask her to send Zezola something. If he forgets, he will not be able to move forward or backward. So we're like, what is that about? So, of course, the father forgets, and his ship is stuck at port until it's brought to the prince's attention that he broke his promise to Zezola. So he goes to seek out the fairy that's related to the dove, and the fairy gives the prince a date tree, a hoe, a golden pail, and a silk cloth to bring back to his daughter. Zezola plants the date tree, and it grows, and a fairy emerges from it to grant her wish, which is to attend a feast. Zezola rides to the feast on a white thoroughbred and a white horse. We're going to see, we're going to get to Don Juan, but a white horse is going to kind of go through many variants of this tougher Cinderella character. So she jumps on her horse, rides to the ball or the feast, and the king falls in love with her. She attends 2 more feasts, and after the 3rd, she rushes off and loses her shoe. There's no midnight anything. She just leaves. Zezola weds the prince, and the moral of the tale is those who oppose the stars are crazy, which is kind of interesting. It's a very amoral moral of the tale. It's about fate. And I think it's an interesting tale because we can ask ourselves, what does Zezola have to do to merit the support of the fairies? She kills her stepmother, and she still is granted the hand of a prince. So there's not that much of a moral to the tale. She also is kind of powerful because through her connection to the fairies, when her father breaks his promise, his ship can't move. So she's connected to powerful female characters. So we have these really powerful women. This just gives you a sense of Basile versus Perrault. I'm not going to talk a lot about Perrault, but he's going to change a lot of things. So he's read Basile's tale. So any changes he makes are reflective of his ideology, of his ideas of women, and etc. So Basile gives his heroine a name, Zezola. Perrault, his heroine only has nicknames, and she's nicknamed Cinderella and Cinderbottom. In Basile, the heroine is a princess. In Perrault, the heroine, is the daughter of a gentleman, so he lowers the heroine status. He streamlines the tale. So instead of 6 sisters, he has 2. Instead of many feasts, he only has 2 balls. So there's a lot of streamlining going on. When Cinderella helps her sisters prepare for the ball, in Perrault, we see her, we know that Cinderella's oppressed and has to clean, but we don't know exactly what she's doing. And here we have Perrault Cinderella is so self-effacing that she helps her sisters get all beautiful for the ball and does up their hair. And so keep in mind that she does up their hair because that's going to come back. And then Cinderella's fairy godmother helps her conditionally. She says, if you will be a good girl. And then she gives her a curfew of midnight. So Perrault's tale is more pedagogical. The fairy gives the heroine a warning, and her support is conditional. And then his moral of the tale at the end is about graciousness. And he talks about Cinderella's fairy godmother. And he says, by training her, meaning the fairy godmother trained her, educated her so much and so well, she made her into a queen. Whereas Zazola didn't have to do anything. She's born a princess, she kills her stepmom, and she, marries a prince. So there's that pedagogical impulse to Perrault's tale. And while Perrault streamlines much of Basile's tale, he cuts out, the feast and the number of sisters. He actually goes out of his way to talk more about her oppression and the tasks that she does. So Basile, for instance, says, Zazola ended up being demoted from the royal chamber to the kitchen, from a canopied bed to the hearth, from sumptuous silks and gold to rags, from the scepter to the spit. And not only did her status change, but her name as well, for she was no longer called Zazola, but Cinderella Cat. Perrault, this is the one part he expands on Basile's tale. She, the stepmother, made her carry out the vilest tasks of the house. It was she, Cinderella, who cleaned and put away the dishes, who scrubbed the room of the mistress of the house and those of her daughters. She slept at the top of the house in an attic on a squalid mattress. So it's more abject. She's being more oppressed. While her sisters were in rooms with parquet floors and fashionable beds and mirrors in which they could see themselves from head to toe. The poor girl put up with it all patiently and didn't dare complain about it to her father, who would have scolded her because his wife dominated him completely. When she would finish her work, she would go sit in the corner of the chimney in the ashes, which led to her being called Cinderbottom or Cinderella. And Perrault has a habit of setting up dysfunctional families where a woman is in charge. Like, men have to be in charge for families to function properly. Disney's going to do that too. But that's a theme we see in many of Perrault's tales. So D'Aulnoy would have known Basile's tale, and she would have known Perrault's tale, and then she would have known Marie-Jeanne L'Héritier's tale, Finette, or the Discreet Princess. So, and actually this is an interesting thing with translation, because in French, it's Finette or the adroite princesse, meaning clever or skillful. And when it gets rebranded in England, her agency is diminished a bit by calling her discreet. But there's a reason for that. So L'Héritier tells this other tale that's not exactly a Cinderella tale, but it will influence D'Aulnoy. And in this tale, a father goes off to the Crusades and he leaves each of his 3 daughters a glass distaff and locks them in the tower because he doesn't really trust his daughters except Finette, who's very smart. Prince Richcraft sneaks into the tower and seduces Finette's 2 sisters, and they become pregnant. So we can see these were tales meant for adults. And when they get pregnant, the distaffs break. So we can see that the distaffs are associated with their virginity. So that seduction leads to the broken distaffs. Richcraft tries to seduce Finette, and first she waves a hammer at him when he tries to get in her bedroom, and she waves it as if she's waving a fancy fan. Then she tricks him and sets a bed up over a sewer in the castle, and when he goes to bed, he falls into the sewer and is injured Richcraft wants to take revenge on Finette, so he lines a barrel full of blades and he means to push Finette in it, but instead she pushes Richcraft into the barrel and he's mortally injured. Later, after Finette throws Richcraft in the barrel, the two sisters each give birth to a son, and Finette rides a horse, cross-dresses as the knight San Antonio, pretends to be able to heal the wounded Richcraft, and leaves the two babies with Belavois, Richcraft's brother, and the king, Richcraft's father. So she just leaves the babies there. What I found interesting, this does get translated into English, and the pregnancy is taken out. So you can see how the tales get adapted to a child audience. And this is, so in the, this tale also has its own legacy. I'm in my book, The Lost Princess, I'm really interested, because I would hear, oh, the women wrote these fairy tales in the 1690s, and then they disappeared. And actually that is far from the truth, as you will see. So in the 1690s, the department store Le Bon Marché, which was one of the first department stores ever in the West, they used this fairy tale, the Clever Princess, as a marketing tool. So you can see, I don't know if you can see at the bottom, you have like a 1 and a 2. You would go to the department store and then you'd get part of the story Finette. And on the front, you have the image, and on the back, you have the story. And in order to put together the story, you had to keep going back to the department store and collecting them. And I was sort of curious, like, what did they edit? Did they edit out the agency of the heroine? And here's the beginning of the story. And you can see in the image there, we have Richcraft dressed. He actually disguises himself as an old woman and he's brought up into the tower. But it also has, dedicates one postcard to her, throwing him, setting up the trap where he falls into the sewer. And the second one where she, gracefully walks away as he's rolling in a barrel full of blades, and she basically kills him. So we have, these heroines who defended themselves. So now we have to think, there's no big, Perrault's Cinderella tale is not dominant. Donois, again, read Basile, she read Perrault, and then she read Legacies' tale about this woman who pushed a guy in a barrel and killed him. And she's going to write a story called Finette-Cendron or Finette-Cinders, taking the Finette from Legacies. And in her tale, and we'll talk about all the differences, but just to give you the outline of the tale, we have an impoverished king and queen who were chased from their kingdom, and so they lose their kingdom. They have 3 daughters, Flower of Love, Night Beauty, and Finette. Because they can no longer offer luxuries to the spoiled princesses, the queen proposes to the king that they abandon them in the forest. Finette, also referred to as Fine Ear, overhears the conversation and brings fresh butter, eggs, milk, and flour to her fairy godmother, Merluche, in order to make her a cake and ask her advice. And Merluche sends her a beautiful horse. So again, the horse theme that we see in Basile. Merluche gives Finette a ball of thread to help her find her way back home. When the queen abandons the princesses in the forest, Finette helps them return, and then her sisters beat and scratch her. Finette overhears her parents a second time. They're going to be abandoned again, and this time she brings chickens, a rooster, and some rabbits to her fairy godmother, Merluche, who gives her ashes to spread to help her get back home, which we can see the connection with cinders and ashes. This time, however, the godmother gives her a warning. Don't bring your sisters back. They're nasty. Don't help them. But of course, Finette is too nice to do that and saves them a second time. So when they're abandoned the third time, Finette's like, I can't go back to Merluche. She's not going to help. She's going to be pissed at me. I disobeyed her. And so she puts like dresses and jewelry, so she has wealth with her. And one of her sisters drops peas to help the sisters get back home, but birds eat up the peas and they're lost in the forest. Then Finette finds an acorn and plants it. And every day she says, grow, grow, beautiful acorn, and does this several days. And every day it grows bigger and bigger. And then every time it grows bigger, she's climbing and climbing and climbing up the tree. And one day she sees a beautiful castle and is like, hey, we can go there. They think, well, maybe princes live there. It's a beautiful castle. The sisters steal Finette's elegant clothes, they make themselves up, and they have Finette pass as their scullery maid. But it turns out that the castle, it doesn't belong to princes, it belongs to an ogre couple. The three princesses are greeted by the ogress, who's 15 feet tall and 30 feet wide. And she wants to hide the girls from her husband because she wants to eat them all up herself. Finette tricks the ogre husband into getting into the oven, and he's reduced to ash, he's reduced to ash. Then she cuts off the ogress's head with an axe while doing her hair. The three sisters take over the castle, and despite Finette's heroism, they make her cook and clean and sweep and everything, and they won't let her accompany them to the balls that they go in town. So they're going to balls, and one evening, Finette is sitting by the ashes in the hearth, and she finds a key, and it opens up a beautiful chest with luxurious clothes, diamonds, and lace, and she dresses for the ball. As soon as she appears, guests either admire or envy this mystery woman who she calls herself Cinders. So the first half of the tale, she's Finette, and the second half of the tale, she's called Cinders. And what's interesting in this tale, she goes to many balls. And there's not this idea the prince is having a ball to get married. It's just like she's going out there, she's having a good time. She sets fashion trends at court. She never encounters the prince ever. And the narrator tells us that she makes all the men unfaithful to their lovers, and she's very worldly. You know, she's not there looking for a hubby. One night, Finette-Cinders leaves the ball later than usual, and the only reason why she leaves earlier is she needs to get home before her sisters do, so that they don't know that she went to the ball. There's no curfew, there's nothing. So she leaves the ball later than usual, and on her way home loses one of her mules. So in Danois, she doesn't lose a slipper, a glass slipper as in Perrault, she loses a mule. And the next day, the Prince Chéri, who we had not mentioned at all thus far in the tale, is out hunting, and he finds the mule in the forest, and he falls in love with the shoe, without knowing who it belongs to. And the prince informs his parents that he will marry none other than the woman whose foot fits into the shoe. But he has no idea, he's never seen her, nothing. And then in Danois, Finette knows this is happening, so she's like, okay, I'm gonna go try that. That's my shoe, I'm gonna go get my shoe. And she, no one fetches her. She jumps on the horse in a magnificent dress, and she rides to court on her beautiful Spanish horse. And as she goes by her sisters who are walking, because they want to try on the shoe, she splashes them with mud. And then the prince, of course, it ends happily, where the prince, the queen, and the king beg Finette to marry the prince because they're afraid he's going to die. And she says, I won't marry him unless she tells her story. She explains how her parents had lost their kingdom and they were abandoned, blah, blah, blah. They're happy to find out Finette's a princess and not a commoner. And the prince's parents also realized they were the ones who took the land away from Finette's parents, and Finette will not marry the prince until her parents' kingdom is restored. Which is really important in a period. Danois herself was forcibly married at 13 to a man in his 40s. All of these women had forced marriages. Kings and queens had forced marriages. So the whole idea that the heroine is negotiating her own marriage to the prince on her terms is really empowering. We have a very powerful heroine here. So just to think to take a step back, the tale slices together two tales. Little Thumbling, in which the youngest of 6 brothers saves the sons from parental abandonment and from ogres, and it's similar to Hansel and Gretel. And very likely, the French tradition influenced Hansel and Gretel because in 1685, the tyrannical Louis XIV abolished Protestantism in France. And so French Protestants fled to Germany, brought French literature with them, and many of the Grimm's informants were of French Huguenot background. So there's this connection. So we have the first part of the tale of Finette-Cendron is more Hansel and Gretel, and then we have the second part of the tale that is the Cendron part of the tale after the ogres. So Don takes the Finette from l'héritier. She's calling attention to the connections between the two heroines. She's also, we'll come back to Fine Oreille because that's going to play out in some of the oral versions of her tales. The fairy godmother is called Merluche, which is a play on the famous medieval French fairy Melusine, who protects noble families. She's the founder of the noble family. And the horse returns, and we'll see it all the way through the film, Three Hazelnuts. Wait, for Cinderella. The relation between l'héritier's Finette and Finette-Cendron, we have both heroines save their sisters despite their sisters' problematic behavior. They're willing to kill those who threaten them. So Finette basically kills Richcraft. Finette burns the ogre in the oven and kills the ogress. They demonstrate wisdom and the ability to rule. L'héritier's Finette, we learn in the tale, she gives her father advice on treaties. She's very wise, like a statesman. And Don Juan's Finette is described as being born to rule, and she negotiates her marriage. So they both negotiate. They're both negotiators, which would have been associated with men. So they're challenging the domain, the sphere of male activity, and saying women can do this too. And Tatiana Korniva also notes in both versions, the character doesn't dream about her passive rescue by some Prince Charming. They save themselves. They're active in bettering their situation. When we think of connections between all the tales, Finette-Cendron, there's little winks to the earlier versions. So in Finette-Cendron, her father identifies her through the cat's hole, so associating cat Cinderella. The sisters are connected to distaffs, so whereas in l'héritier, the distaffs represent the chastity of the heroines, in Don Juan, they beat Finette with their distaffs. So we have this tale that is Hansel and Gretel and then Cinderella, but ashes ashes form a thread that connect them, that sew the two parts of the tale together. So we have Finette is given ashes by her fairy godmother. She reduces the ogre to a mountain of ashes or cinders. And then right before she goes to the ball, she sits on a heap of cinders. So it's like a recurring motif that brings the tales, sews the tales together in a way. Finette-Cendron is also reduced to being a scullion or souillon, and it's the same term Perrault used, and it is not a word it's not a common word in French literature. So it's very likely, that Don Juan is drawing from Perrault's version. And there's and I think she's also making fun of Perrault's version, because a lot of these fairy tales in the 1690s, as I said, these people knew each other. So they're winking at each other, they're taking stabs, they're joking. And so, we have Perrault's version where Cinderella groups her sisters and does up their hair. Here, Finette does up the ogress's hair as a ruse to chop off her head. Cinderella goes to the ball twice versus many times. Perrault's Cinderella is more gentle and kind. And in Don Juan's version, it's said that Fleur d'Amour and Belle de Nuit, or Flower of Lovin', her two sisters pay court to her, and who is born to rule. So she's still kind of above. Perrault, she's sharing. In Don Juan, she's a bit above them. We have a total shoe fetish in Don Juan because the prince never met the heroine. We've got the horse, and Don Juan's Cinderella setting the conditions of her marriage. So she's so they're both drawing from Basile, but Don Juan has a much more empowered heroine. And this tale doesn't just disappear. So what I did is I'll go back and forth between these two pages. So Don Juan wrote her tale, and that tale gets folklorized, what we call folklorization of literary tales. So let's say her tales circulated in chapbook form, so cheap paperback books that could have been bought by lower class people who knew how to read. And even if the literacy rate in France was quite low, imagine you have a village and you have a guy who knows how to read or a woman who knows how to read, and they get a version of Finette-Cendron and they read it, and then they're like, hey, let me tell you this story I just read. And then that person tells another person the story, and then it evolves, and it's like playing telephone. And so folklorists now realize that there are some tales that are collected from oral tradition that were originally literary tales that became folklorized. And this Finette-Cendron is a perfect example of that. So there's a version in French Poitou, where we have rich lords. Her name is Cendruse. The first part of the story is missing, but the second part, father goes to a fair. It's a mass instead of a ball, so oftentimes the story gets changed according to the conditions of the storytellers. In the Poitou version, she doesn't have a mule. It's a pantoufle or slipper. So Perrault's version is mixing in the oral tradition with Dandois' version, but Dandois is the main version here. And the king in the Poitou version finds a shoe and wants to marry the owner and has no idea who it is. So that's coming from Dandois. Poitou, a lot of people from Poitou emigrated to Canada. And then at a certain point, Acadians were forced out of Canada, and some of them went to Missouri. And a tale called Finette-Cendron was collected from a miner in the early 20th century. And he has a whole version, an oral version of Finette-Cendron, where the parents are poor. The character's name is Finette. She has 2 sisters. She has a godmother. We have the 3 items, the string, and in the Missouri version, it's a pelette de corde. In the French version, pelette de fil, so very, very close, which is how we can trace it back to the literary version. The Missouri version maintains the ashes, but instead of peas, it's grains of wheat, and the birds eat them up. They change the ogres into giants. Finette kills the ogre and ogress. The godmother appears and does something with the pumpkin, so that's a contamination of Perrault, but mainly this is a Dandois tale. And she goes to a party, and I think it's funny because it's written in French, Missouri French, and she goes to a party. She goes to a party instead of a ball. And so that version is very close. So we have like one trajectory the tale took was from the French countryside to probably Quebec. I should look and see if there's versions of it, to Missouri. And another branch of the tale went to Germany and Czechoslovakia. So Tiny Ears is the Grimms collected Tiny Ears from Ludwig von Haxhausen, who was one of their informants, from a French Huguenot family. And she gave them an oral version of Finette-Cendron, which they collected, they documented, but they never wanted to publish it because they felt it was too French. And it's very close. We have a king and a stepmother instead of a mother. The main character is Tiny Ears, and one of the 2 sisters gets named Finette. That's one of the big changes. Instead of a fairy godmother, the godmother is an enchantress or a witch, and that happens a lot when we move. French fairies become German witches and sorceresses when these tales get adapted and folklorized. We have the ball of yarn, peas, but no ashes in this version. We have the ogres, and in this version, the sisters kill the ogre and ogress together. So they work together, it's not Finette. So we have the version of Tiny Ears, and then there's a later version that was collected in Germany, which maintains the name of the fairy Merluche, and is very close to the Dandois with the ball of thread, ashes, grain, and Finette kills the ogre and everything. Then it went from German lands to Czechoslovakia, and there are both German translations and Czech translations of Dandois since the 18th century. So we don't know, and there was so much German in Czechoslovakia at the time, in earlier periods, but we have it was very important in Czech. That was one of her tales that became very important in the Czech regions. So Kuban collected a version, she's called Popelka in Czech, in Czech for Czech readers. And in both the Czech versions, the couple they're not royal, they're a poor couple. And it's very close. We have Merluzi, we have the peas, the ashes, the ball of thread. Cinderella is associated with climbing trees. They push the ogre into the oven. They cut the ogress's head off while doing her hair. And then Kova is going to feed into the 1973 film, and I'll come back to that. But we have, these. So her version spread all over the place, through translations, but also in folklorized versions of Finette-Cinders. And there continued to be a legacy in France. So a lot of French people will be like, no, it ended. But here we have Finette-Cendron. And so this is a print version where we have the ogress. You can see her chopping the head off, pushing the ogre in the oven. We have a version from 1862 that also shows the violence, because I was like, are they going to tone down the violence? But there she is, brandishing her axe to cut the head off. It also went to England, and you can see this would have been a version designed for younger people. Some images of the ogress from, I think both 19th century. This is an 18th century where she loses her mule in the woods. And then it seemed like some authors really liked to include an image of her splashing her sisters as she rides by them. So these are both 18th century versions, and here's a 1931 version. So Don Juan did not disappear so quickly. And just to, let's see. And then we have, it sort of culminates in this 1973 film where I consulted with a Czech scholar who's like, Don Juan's version was, to do the film, they took Němcova's version, the last Czech version of Finette-Cinders, and blended it with a more grim-like Cinderella tale. But Don Juan, there are traces of Don Juan in a 1973 film, and I think that is important. And just to give you, because I want to pull out a little bit, and I'm telling you, yeah, Don Juan was more important, but I want to sort of prove it to you. So just quickly, I just want to show you, and this is more for effect. These were her works published in the 19th century. So the first page is from 1909 to 29, 30 to 55, 55 to 80, 80 to 99. So she was regularly published. Flaubert read her. He was reading Don Juan's fairy tales while he was writing Madame Bovary. I was looking at his journal, and he's like, oh, I'm writing about this, horrible bourgeois life, dreary, blah, blah, but I'm so having fun reading Don Juan's fairy tales. So I found that really, could he have written Madame Bovary without Madame Don Juan? Maybe not. He needed that. Here are theatrical, so in England, she was also very popular through she was more popular than Perrault in the 18th century. A lot of her tales were published as Mother Bunch tales and Queen Mab tales and were not attributed to her. And then many of her tales were adapted to the theater. So these are just, not printed, but theatrical, staged versions of her tales that occurred in Britain from 1800 to 1899. Finette-Cendron didn't make it into that group. And what I find interesting is there are certain tales that take better. So in England, they liked the ram better than Finette-Cendron, but in Germany, they liked Finette-Cendron and the bee and the orange tree. So it's kind of interesting to see which tales flourish where. But here we have from 1811 to 1847, almost every single year, one of her tales is being staged in England. So that's from 69, 70 to 80, 81 to 98. The entire century, her tales are being staged. but they're also being read. These also made it to the United States, because I was surprised to find American editions of Don Juan's tales. And so here we have, starting in 1843, many of these were first produced in England and then made their way to the United States. And it goes on, so you can see how many, these are all just US representations, staged versions of her tales in the US, mostly New York. And here are just some different images. There was a German version, so there was a German staging of Finette-Cinders, but I could never find it. This image here is, so this is her tale, The Ram, was very popular in England and kind of took on its own life. And this is The White Cat, was one of her most famous tales, and it made it into a 1965 Mexican comic book. So just to give you a sense of the breadth of where these tales went, this is a board game that was based on one of her tales. This is actually a board game based on Planchet's staged version of one of her tales. So we see her influence in all these different medias. And part of what got me interested in this is a colleague of mine wrote about this Marlborough fancy dress ball. So let's say People magazine is going to talk about, what did Brad Pitt and so wear at this Halloween gathering. It would be the equivalent of that. And so they do this article on the elite guests who go to this fancy dress ball in 1874. These are the outfits they wore. So everyone in England would have, they didn't mention the names. They didn't mention this was based on a Don Juan tale. People recognized Princess Fairstar and Prince Sherry. They recognize the White Cat and the Prince and the fair one with the golden hair. And so she has equal standing to Perrault. The Grimms were just getting started. They weren't very well known. She was part of the fairy tale canon in this period. So just a couple takeaways. The fairy tales that are familiar to us today were shaped by women writers. I could do a whole nother thing on Rapunzel, which is actually a tale by Mademoiselle de la Fosse that was translated by an Austrian, and the Grimms thought it was an authentic German tale, but it is not. It is a translation of La Fosse. And their names and contributions get buried under the dominance of the Perrault, Grimm, Anderson, Triumphantly, and Walt Disney. I really blame Walt. Because it's really with him that they become the main sources of our fairy tales. That was not the case before that. Fairy tales by women writers have often enjoyed and continue to enjoy the status of classic, which is a concept that changes from generation to generation. So we think of these tales as being age old. They're not. They all have context, they all have histories, and women played important roles in this. Finette-Cinders and the White Cat were considered classic in different periods and places, and we often aren't aware that women we wouldn't have Beauty and the Beast without Don Juan, and I can talk about that if you have any questions about that. Rapunzel, I just mentioned. So these were popular tales. Fairy tales are also, a lot of feminist writers have critiqued fairy tales because they're so passive. They're not inherently disempowering. The women of the 1690s in France wrote fairy tales to empower themselves, to challenge arranged marriage, to challenge the king. There are satirical tales that challenged Louis XIV. German women writers in the early 19th century modeled themselves, decapitates, I forget what it's called. It was like a gathering that they kind of modeled on French salons, and they used fairy tales to empower themselves, explore female experiences of women. Okay, so thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.